Hey, welcome back to the channel. Got a little something on the bench for you here. So this is the super duper mega ultralight 138G4S 5-incher V2.2. So we've already went through the frame, all the little pieces and parts, doodads, things that we wanted to modify. We've gone through the VTX, so that's out. So 2 videos there. We did a video on the pigtail, all the little things needed to get that capacitor to work correctly and to handle a good crash, and the beeper, how to cut and solder and do everything to get that nice and tight. And then we did the receiver, so we got that all ready to go on. And we also have gone through the flight controller, what I recommend doing before you do anything else. So all those videos are out. So this is the actual final build and flight of the V2.2. So let's get started. Alright, so the first thing we want to do is go ahead and get our frame, and I've left it just the same as I did after the frame and buzzer video. So everything is kind of just the way it was left. I'm going to go ahead and take all the TPU and top plate and standoffs off the frame, and I'll leave the stack mount screws on the frame. So let me go ahead and get that done real quick. Alright, so we got everything off the frame. So we have our top plate and all of our TPU removed. The only thing left is the 4 screws that came with the frame kit, and these are the stack mounting screws, and they are metal. And I have taken an M2, I don't know if you can see there's 4 of them, M2 nut. There's a kit, it's a nylon M2 spacer nut screw assortment kit, 180 piece. That's what I use. And it comes with, now don't look in here because this is a lot of years of kind of rotating inventory, if you will, but it comes with all these little nylon nuts. So that's what I'm using here. So not only does the nylon nut retain your metal screw, but it also is an insulator and a washer to raise the stack just a little bit higher, so that we can fit our the components that might reach the carbon fiber, and then also our strap underneath the board. So it made a nice little spacer. Now the next step, before we go any further, I just wanted to let you know that I have taken some emery cloth and I have sanded the inside of all these grooves for the strap. So the inside here and the inside here. It's pretty important to do that, or it will wear your strap out pretty quick. The edge of the carbon on the inside of that is sharp enough. It'll wear your strap out pretty quick. So just keep in mind, I went ahead and sanded that off camera. The next step is to go ahead and get our all-in-one. So we have our all-in-one here, and we're going to pull him out, and then we're going to grab these gummies, and your pigtail should already be done. Alright, get this out of the way. So our gummies have 2 sides. See if I can zoom in for you here. So if you look at the gummy, the top or away from my hand is a bit thinner. See, there's a thicker side and a thinner side. The thicker side is going down. So when we put this into our all-in-one, we want to put it in that orientation. So this is the bottom of the board, and this is the top of the board. So you have your OSD chip, your gyro and accelerometer chip processor. So that's the top of the board, and then also our USB. So the thinner side and thicker side, okay? So we'll just get all the gummies, just place those in the grooves. I don't know if I was a big fan of the slotted, instead of having the actual hole, having the slotted. I don't know if it's really that much of a benefit for me. I kind of prefer to have the one single hole. So, all right, we have our flight controller in place. So now we can kind of see where we're going to have things, okay? If you see Pyrodrone in this frame, so you can kind of see the front and back of the frame anyway. And then the flight controller, let's go ahead and just set that aside for now. We're going to go ahead and mount the motors. We already know that our flight controller is going to fit in properly. We'll get our motors and our strap put on. I have all 4 motors. Now these motors came with the E-Sheen, the ER349, the GT349. It's basically the Diatone GT349 or the E-Sheen ER349. They don't make these motors anymore. I've contacted Diatone and said, hey, you know, what's the scenario? The company that made them for Diatone isn't making them anymore, I guess. So the 1408 4000 kV motor with the M5 post is no longer available. I really like these motors. I feel like there's something special about them. If you're using these motors, then hey. If not, I am still looking for an exact match. Haven't found it yet. So we're gonna mount these motors up. There's really only one thing. Let me get this out of the package here. There's really only one thing to keep in mind with when you're putting your motor screws in. Just make sure I got the right one. These motors came off of the prototype version 1, so they've been pre-cut. So when you're putting the motor screws in, one thing you want to keep an eye on, like this motor screw that I'm using is 6 millimeters. Okay, so 6 millimeter motor screw. If you try to put an 8 millimeter, it's going to go into the windings of these motors. So that's kind of the one thing to kind of keep thinking about. See how far that screw protrudes through the frame? It's a little bit more than 1 millimeter. If you have screws that are too long, you'll go into the windings, the copper wires on your motor, and it'll make for all kinds of problems. And obviously, if you don't have enough screws sticking through, then that's a problem as well, because then you'll strip the threads out of your motor the first time you crash it. The other thing is, when you're putting your motor screws in, I like to take my screwdriver or my tool, and I'll line my motor up and my screw up, but I won't turn it in. I'll turn it counterclockwise till you hear a little pop. Can you hear that? Okay. So counterclockwise, you hear that little pop, then you know that you've caught the right threads and you won't cross thread your screws. And then leave that first one loose, and then all 4 of them loose, and then tighten them all together once they're all lined up. But go ahead and just counterclockwise until you feel that little pop, and the screw will go in a little bit. You won't never strip the base of that motor out. If you just put them in there and then start screwing down, especially if you have some TPU, skid plates or something on there, it's really easy to strip them out. So that's kind of the only advice I got as far as putting in the screws. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to go ahead and put the battery strap in, and I'm going to put all 4 motors on the frame. There's no sense in going through anything more. It's just mounting them all up. You're obviously going to have a lot more wire than me. These, like I said, these came off of the version 1. So I'll go ahead and get that done real quick. All right, so we have our frame. We have our battery strap laced around. It's much easier to get that in now before, if you put that on top. So we got that through. And then also I put in a couple strips of the Umagod super sticky battery pad. So it's the thicker one. It just kind of helps save your Lipo from the screws. And the only thing to keep in mind is not to cover up any. You see these 4 screws here. So make sure that you don't get the head covered, these 2 for your standoffs. And then your standoffs. So make sure you don't cover up your standoff holes as well. and that'll keep your lipo from sliding around. All right, so we have all our motors mounted on, and it's just finger tight. I didn't crank them down or anything. I'm gonna give them a little snug, and we'll test fly, do all that, and then if everything is perfect, then I'll pull each one out. And I like to use this Loctite. Just put like a tiny little bit on the head of the screw and lock them into the motors. But that's after I know that everything is ready to go. So the next step, we have our strap done. We have our 4 motors and the gummy or the lipo pad. And now we'll go ahead and put our all-in-one in. And now you can see the amount of space that's in there, because the gummies are the thick side down, and then we put in that little nylon nut. It gives us like the perfect amount of space underneath. So there should be good airflow, and the strap won't be wearing itself off on the MOSFETs. Okay. All right, so our next step is to go ahead and get things soldered up. I'm just going to pull this strap flat. All these things that we already made up that need to go on. Now, for me, I like to get this put on first. If you add all these peripherals, okay, onto your all-in-one, then any of the grounds that you have to solder is going to wick away your heat. So right now, it's just the flight controller all-in-one by itself. But once you add those items and the camera and other items, then when you go to solder your ground, it's just going to make it that much more difficult. Now, as far as length, we just kind of wanted that snug, so I'm going to go ahead and get a lipo, and I'm just going to make sure it's where we want it, okay? And then also I have the TPU to put in place. All right, so we have our lipo. This is the lipo of my choice. So this is a 4S 650 Tattoo XT30. And if we go ahead and mount that underneath the quad, I'm going to mount it so that the XT30 is on this side. So when we put the power line on that leg, we'll have our connection. I don't want to do that, because that's kind of a pain. Definitely not this. So I'm just going to mount that right here. All right. Well, we're not going to make any connection here, but I don't want that much sticking out. I don't want it to be able to raise up into the props. So I'm gonna strain relief that where it's basically right there. Excellent. Okay. So we're just going to give this a, if you can see in there, we're just going to push those down right about there. And then I'm going to hold that. Okay. So now we have the length of wire that we need. And in the orientation, you can kind of see, if you pull that straight, you see that they're not even lengths. So that's kind of important that we've got it angled down and at a curve, so then it becomes flush at our measurement in the shape that we want. All right, so we'll go ahead and now, as far as your power leads, you're going to solder them into these 2 pads here. Okay. So I'm just going to cut enough insulation the size of those pads. There's no sense in making your power leads, like the end of your wire, sticking out so much, because you're only soldering into that pad. You know, don't make your exposed wire larger than your pad. Go ahead and fire up the soldering iron here. Let me get these guys out of the way. Those were just for example. Get some tinning flux on the wire. We'll get our solder. And then I like to use rosin paste for the component itself. You don't need much. Just like a little film. You put too much on there and then sometimes it'll actually, you know, fight you and not let you do what you need to do. Now, got my tip dip here to get my tip nice and clean and ready to go, and then I got a brass pad. Some people like using a sponge. I like to use a little tip dip and a brass, and then you can see that tip is nice and clean and ready to go. So go ahead and solder up our wires here. We're just going to put a thin coating. On each wire. Okay. I'll go ahead and solder up the pads on the flight controller. Now on here I have my temperature set at 350 degrees Celsius. Alright, so we'll do the positive pad first. It'll go quick. And now the negative pad, it'll take a little bit longer. So I'm just going to hold a little. I'm not going to give it all the solder. I'm just going to watch that. Now that's hot enough. I'll give it a little more solder. Now that's right where we need it to be. Let me zoom in a little bit for you here. Now you can see that solder is separate. It's not touching each other, and there's not a ton of solder. You know, it's not like these giant round solder balls, so to speak. That's just enough solder because the wire we have solder on our wire too. So once these come together, that's plenty of solder. But you want to pay attention to the pad. Let me get that in focus for you first. Okay, can you see the pad? It's flowed. The solder has flowed to each corner. So you're not seeing exposed pad on the other side. So that's kind of important. If you have exposed pad on the other side, then it can then it's not soldered all the way on there. So now I just hold this one in place, and let me get my tip cleaned off. If this goes a lot faster if you're not talking to a camera, if you catch my drift. So I just touch it onto the wire first. I get all the solder to flow all the way. Hang up the soldering iron, turn the thing down. And then I have something that's called a linen tester. So you can get in here and really check to make sure that that's separate and it looks good and it's flowed all the way around. The ground is the hardest part on that, especially if you have other things connected, because the ground is connected to the whole device. That ground, it goes everywhere. So it'll wick the heat away a lot faster. You can turn your iron up a little bit, but I noticed that if you turn the iron up a lot more, you just splatter. And that's something that we want to avoid is splattering. Alright, so that looks pretty good. Pretty happy with that. And now the next step is to, we could just check it. We could do a continuity check right now to make sure everything's good. I'm sure everything's fine, but we're going to go ahead and get all of our motor pads ready to go. what I like to do here is put a roll of tape. All right, looks like we had a camera freeze up a little bit, so I've kind of got everything kind of refocused here. So the next step I want to do is go ahead and get the motor wires and our peripherals. The things that we're going to use, we're going to go ahead and solder the pads on the all-in-one. So I've made a little cheat sheet, if you will. The things that we're going to solder up is our VTX. So we have for our VTX, we have the ground 5-volt VTX and T3. The T pad is for our smart audio, and in this case, the VTX is tramp. So, and then the VTX line, which is the camera, 5-volt to supply to the VTX and ground. So we're not going to worry about these other ones except for this one. The wire from the camera has to go to the flight controller. Okay, so it goes from the camera to the flight controller through the OSD chip, and then out the flight controller to the VTX. Does that make sense to you? So from the camera into the OSD, out to the VTX. So once that path is complete, then the only thing we have here is just the camera, because I'm not using these two, because we're going to power our camera. 5-volt and ground is going to go to these pads on the VTX. So if you followed along in the VTX portion, the video that I did, this wire right here is the camera wire that goes to the flight controller. And then these wires are all of these plus these. Okay, so we've already got our hot and ground onto our VTX. On our flight controller, we're going to use the camera pad. We're going to use the ground, the 5-volt, the VTX, and the T3 pad. And then over here for our receiver, which we've already got everything ready to go. We have our 4 wires coming out of our receiver and color coded. We know that our green wire is going to be our smart port telemetry, and our yellow wire is going to be the S-bus. That's how I've wired that. Now remember, I said I was going to take that connector off my R-xsr, so I just have the 4 wires. So what we want to use is these 4 right here. So we're going to solder up the ground, the 5-volt, the RX. It says R1, but this is RX, and then TX. Okay, and then our TX pad. So these 4 pads we're going to use. Maybe that's easy. Made a little check mark on those. All right, and then our beeper, which is mounted to the TPU piece. In your case, you're maybe just going to use zip ties as I did on version 2. Over here we have 5-volt and beeper negative. So the negative lead of that beeper is doing the signal. So the on and off is coming through the negative of the beeper. So we already have that and that. So now we're going over to these 2 pads here. So we have our 5-volt supply going to the beeper, and then the signal on and off is the beeper negative. All right, and we're not worried about any of these. In this build, we're not worried about any of these or any of these. All right, I'm going to go ahead and take some of my rosin paste. I'm just going to put a real thin coating on the motor pads. The other 2 pads we're going to use. And motor pad here. I'm just kind of giving them a little scrub as well. I just like to use a piece of just a piece of wire, and then I ball it up at the end. It acts like a scrub brush and a rosin applicator. Don't scrub too hard, you break off wires in your stuff. So now we have our soldering iron. We have it up to 200 degrees Celsius. Get the tip nice and clean. Grab our solder. Realign my board here. So we have everything soldered up that we need to get soldered. All the pads are done. If you want to, you can solder everything up. That way in the future, if you're wanting to do something else, you can, you know, it's already done for you. I'm not worried about this for myself because this is exactly the way I want this quad to be. And I'm not going to worry about it. So now we're ready to go ahead and solder up our motors. Now I already have these wires pre-cut. Just because it came off of V1, which was a different frame, so they're not going to be perfect. But I just take each motor wire in the so you can see coming out of the motor. So I have all of them lay nice and flat and run straight up. See if I can get my fingers in there to do that for you. So basically nice and flat. And then we'll go ahead and solder them in just like that. I'm going to push them down against the board. So the first wire, and again, I just want to make sure my tip is nice and clean, ready to go, and I'm still at 200 degrees Celsius. Just going to touch the wire, push it in. And then once you see the solder flow at the pad, you're done. All right. Alright, so all of our soldering is completed for our motor wires. I can go ahead and put the TPU protection on them. I tell you what, I think one of the funnest things is just the complication of trying to solder things, you know, on camera, because I have to articulate so that you can see what I'm doing. So the challenge of that, plus obviously just soldering something that small, that's super fun. Let me zoom out for you. Alright, so we have all of our motor wires, and I'm just going to take a chopstick and I'm going to pull my wires flat, kind of cinch them back under the board just a little bit, kind of not to pinch them too much, but you can see. And then when we put our motor protection on, they'll be aligned and ready to go. So at this point in time, I'm going to go ahead and zip tie the TPU protection. If you don't have TPU protectors, then you could just simply wrap, and black electrical tape will work. That's what I've done on many things. You just want to make sure that you get enough coverage. So this is basically where I'm going to be, right here. So I'm going to go ahead and zip tie all those up. All right, there we go. So look at all those wire ties. So we got everything stitched up. All the motor wires are protected. Now you might look at this and go, man, what's going on here? That's crazy. But it's really not crazy, because when you cartwheel this thing at 99.99 mile an hour, things can get out of hand. And with a 5-inch prop going across, you definitely want to protect everything. So I'm going to go ahead and cinch all these down and tighten them up, and snip them all off. I want to give you an idea. Now, I mentioned in the frame video that these are not regular, they're not your run-of-the-mill 4-inch wire ties. That's not what they are. Many years ago, I ordered these from Banggood. They're smaller than a 4-inch wire tie, and they can handle quite an impact and not break. But they're like almost half the size, half the thickness. Let me zoom in on here for you. I don't know if that'll help you out trying to find them or locate them. It's like, I don't know, a bag of 1,000 or something. So I'll go ahead and tidy these up real quick. All right, so got them all clipped off, so we're nice and tightened down here. We have our buzzer, which we did in our buzzer video. So we're gonna go back to our handy dandy little cheat sheet here. And we know that our buzzer will be on these pads next to, so these two little pads right here. So always orientate, here's your USB, here's your USB. So we know that those two pads right there are going to be for our buzzer. So we have our buzzer negative and our positive 5 volt. So our wires need to go over here. Now keep in mind that hole right there is a standoff. Okay, so right here is a standoff. So we want to make sure we have our wires going over to our buzzer, and we want a little bit of slack. I'm going to go ahead and just give them a twist. I'll twist these up. And then we're go ahead and just pull them on over there and pull them. I'm going to pull them down against the board and then up to, or pull them down towards the frame and then pull them up towards the board. And that's about the length that I want those. So I'm going to go ahead and solder up these 2 points here. So we have our ground and our 5 volt. I'm going to twist these back up a little bit. Alright, so our beeper's in place. Everything looks pretty good. I'm just going to go through, because filming this, I want to make sure. I'll go through all these solder joints real quick. Sometimes when I'm filming, trying to look over top of the camera and audio equipment. So I'll go through that real quick. The next step after the beeper is to go ahead and get our VTX hooked up. Let me go ahead and zoom out. We have our VTX ready to go in. We have some spacers that we need to put in place. The beeper is going to go in just like that. Like I said, I got some spacers we need to put in place. So let me get those real quick, and I'm just going to check all my solder joints real fast to make sure they're all nice and smooth and tight. Alright, so it looks like everything's buttoned up pretty good. All the solder joints look pretty solid. Got the VTX sitting here ready to go. Now I'm just going to grab 4 of those nylon M2. I'm just going to put 2 of them together to act like a spacer. We need enough space that our barrel doesn't touch on our flight controller. I'll insulate that in case we get a gnarly crash. That's ground. So if it touches on here to positive, you're going to have a short. So what I'll do is I'll just put it in place where I want it on here. And then right below that, I'm just going to put some silicone tape. Now, I've used rolls and rolls of this stuff. I really like it. It's not like the 3M stuff I've used in the past where it left a residue, or it was like really hard to get off and it, ripped components off your board. This is a Tough and Clear 15-pound poster adhesive. Gorilla makes it, double-sided adhesive, but it's silicone. so it can handle like a pretty good amount of heat, and it won't deteriorate or leave like a nasty residue behind. This I really like this stuff. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to cut a small square, and I'm just going to place it, because it's silicone, there's no worries about, you know, continuity. So I'll go ahead and cut a little square, and I'll put it right on the flight controller, right underneath where this UFL connector is going to be. So if I do crash and I bend a standoff or blow one out, that's not going to come in contact with the flight controller. So let me go ahead and cut a piece of that real quick, and I'll get these 4 nylon nuts cinched down. We're going to go ahead and get the flight controller completely cinched down at this point. The other thing is, in your frame kit you have these locking nuts. You can use all 4 if you want. I'm just going to use a nylon, and then I'll put some Loctite on the tip of it, but I'm going to use 2 of these. So I'll go ahead and grab 2 of these real quick, and that's going to go on the front and the rear standoff for our flight controller. Now, before I get too far, this flight controller standoff may be too long depending on your camera. See how all that sticks off there? So when you put your camera in here and you go to tilt your camera back, depending on how much angle you give it, you may have to cut that screw or use a shorter screw. And off camera here, I'm going to go ahead and use the shorter one. I have plenty of stock. I've got a whole box of M2 screws. Alright, so we have all that taken care of. Now I switched out these the front and rear standoff. I did replace them with a 16mm. So I bought this kit off Amazon, and it has a 16mm M2 screw. You don't have to have these though. If you want to, you can put your nut on there and then measure how far you need to cut it, and then take the screw out and cut it and then put it back in. I would advise not having a long one here, because if you wanted to get some better camera tilt, you're going to bump into it. So now it's 16mm works out pretty good on that. And of course we have the 20mm on each side with a double nylon nuts, so just doubled up, and that gives us a good spacer for the VTX. Oh, and then also here's the little bit of Gorilla adhesive over top of our gyro and accelerometer. And if you look at this component right next to it, that's a voltage regulator. So you definitely don't want your antenna barrel of your UFL touching the leads on that. That will definitely melt. So we've insulated that. So now when we stick our VTX on there, you can see the barrel. That's ground. That's exposed metal, and that's ground. Lay this off to the side. The other thing you can do is just use one of the standoffs there, set it off to the side like that, and then wire that in. And then when you bring it back, it'll give you plenty of slack. I'm probably only going to go to like right there. So that's all the slack that I want. So when I turn this to plug it in, I'll have that little bit of slack. So in case I got to work on it or something, I can just pull one side loose. There we go. So we have our wire from our camera to the flight controller. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to rotate this so that I can solder it easily. We have our cheat sheet here, so we need to rotate it. So now our USB port is over here. So our USB port is over here. And then we have our T-pad for our tramp protocol. Let me make sure we get this out of the way so you can see. So we have our T-pad, which is this one. And then we have our VTX, a 5-volt and ground. And then right there's the camera. So this little dude right there is going to go to that camera line. Okay. So throw this off to the side. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in for you. I'm going to heat up the soldering iron to 200 degrees Celsius. And we're going to go ahead and cut and solder up our VTX. Alright, so we're zoomed in here. We're going to go ahead and cut him. Let me just twist twist him up just a little bit tighter. There we go. We're going to go ahead and cut him to fit right about right there. Get rid of that. And like I said, I mean, these are 30 gauge wires, so they're like super small. You don't have to worry about pre-tinning a 30 gauge wire. Just put a little tin flux on there and it'll go right in. Just make sure your tip's clean. I like to give it a little bit of a bend, and that'll create like a little air gap underneath it. Tell you what, I really need to buy me a new set of tweezers. Alright, so that's our camera line to the flight controller. I want to get that one out of the way first, and then we're going to twist these back up. Let me see here. And we're going to go ahead and cut them right there, and that way, remember, we swing that forward, it's going to give us a nice amount of slack, so we're not too concerned with that. So go ahead and cut those right there. Okay, and then this is extra you can put in your stockpile. So I'm going to go ahead and strip the ends of all these real quick. We'll go ahead and grab our little bit of tinning flux, and we'll just give it a little dab to each one of these. Doesn't need too much. Go ahead and tighten this bundle back up. And now we need to decipher which one's which. I mean, we obviously know which one's ground and hot, so we'll go ahead and get those soldered on first. Alright, so those are all soldered in. So our ground, our 5-volt, and this is our camera, our VTX. So this is the camera going into the flight controller through our OSD chip and then coming out here to go to our VTX. And then this is our tramp protocol. So on our sticks, we can change the menu of this VTX using our sticks. It's a pretty nice feature. And our camera is going to be right here. But for now, I just want to leave this the way it is because we're going to put our receiver right on top of here. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the receiver and we'll go ahead and mount it up. Let me zoom out real quick. So we have our R-xsr, and you may have the connector still on yours, but I have removed the connector and I have soldered the wires directly to the R-xsr. You can attempt this if you want. It's just the pads are really, really tiny, and you know, you can burn it up. So, or when you go to depin the connector, you can rip the pads off the board. It's not fun. So now we have to put this into the quadcopter. I already have some of the grill adhesive on the back. I need to clean this off with some alcohol, just kind of clean off any residue or grime. So let me do that real quick. So we're ready to go ahead and stick this on to the VTX. I'm going to stick the VTX and receiver together in this manner. So just like that. And that's it. That dude ain't coming off. That 15-pound adhesive is not going to allow that to come off of there. And I'm just going to pull my wires in like so. And now with our cheat sheet, we have our USB connectors right here. Okay, so our USBs right there. Turn our orientation. So now here we have our T1, R1, 5-volt, and ground. It's out of your way. Could you see now? So these 4 pads right here is going to be our receiver. So I'm going to cut these wires so that they're, if I push my VTX just about right there, that'll give me enough slack. Don't want too much slack or things vibrate like crazy. We're going to go ahead and bring it to the furthest pad away. All right, throw them in it. Go ahead and expose the end of the wire, and we'll get that soldered up. Alright, I've already fluxed, put some tinning flux on the end of our wires. Now, I'm going to put a little bit of the rosin on our solder joints here because they're dry. Go ahead and give it a little bit of little catalyst so when we go to solder. Again, my soldering iron is just at 200 degrees Celsius. No need to make a splattery mess. So as you can see, we have our ground, our 5-volt, our smart port telemetry, and our S-bus. So green and yellow. And then here we have our ground, our 5-volt, and our S-bus, and so this is the R-X pad for S-bus, and then TX pad for our smart port telemetry. Okay, and that'll come in play when we get into beta flight. So now all we have to do is situate our VTX in place where we want it. So all that is in play, and now it's a nice tight bundle. Nothing's going to go anywhere in a big massive crash. And we're going to crisscross these wires here. This one will go back and come out the back of the frame with the VTX antenna, and then this one will go to the arm. And I'm going to go ahead and put another nut on here and cinch the VTX down because it's finished. Alright, so basically we got everything wired up. We got everything soldered on. We don't have to worry about that RX going anywhere, because that, even if that VTX gets really hot, that's the beauty of that Gorilla silicone, is it doesn't lose its adhesive properties. So that baby ain't going anywhere. So we're going to go ahead and turn. So now we have the front of the quadcopter here. We have the rear of the quadcopter here. These two, the VTX and the receiver antenna, is going to go in line. And then this one here is going to wrap and go underneath. Basically like that. Alright. So in here we have a little bag of goodies. And inside this bag are 2 screws, and these 2 screws are kind of important. We're not going to use the washers. The TPU that comes with the frame, and also the one that I've made, is thick enough. We don't need to use the washers. The washers also will make your camera kind of slide around a little easy. So these screws are rather small. If you can see, the barrel of them is not very long. Okay, the reason why is because if the screws are too long, they'll bottom out when you put the screw into the camera housing. See if I can articulate that so you can see it. The mounting hole there, it'll dead end. You know, when you screw that in there, it'll kind of bottom out. So let me go ahead and put this up through here. So I know, just for me, I already know that these cameras, the wire on the top is the top of the camera. So the orientation, so this is the bottom and this is the top. You do want to kind of know that before you mount it in there. So go ahead and get him mounted in. I'm just going to line up the holes. So I'm going to test this hole here first. There's 2, I made 2 holes. I 3D printed that one and then I melted that one. I'm going to use the upper one for now just to kind of see. So I'm just going to line that up. Make sure it's lined up. And then I'm going to take my screw, put it on the end there, push it into that hole. I'm going to turn it counterclockwise until I feel that little pop, because I don't want to cross thread my camera, or then it's shot. You know, there's really nothing you can do about it. If you cross thread it, there's really not a whole lot you can do. So just push it in there, pretty good amount of force, counterclockwise, until you feel that click. All right, and then I'm just gonna tighten it down. Now, if you tighten it and then it's like right there, that's like it's not gonna turn anymore, that's tight, and your camera moves around, which mine isn't, I'm exaggerating. But if your camera moves around, then that screw is too long. It bottomed out into the frame of your camera. The screw's too long, so you're gonna have to use a washer. But for me, my camera's tight as can be with just one screw tight. This one here, I still... Alright. Pretty important not to destroy that mounting point. See that camera's in there pretty good now. And that's pretty much at the angle I want, 30 degrees. I could pull it down. I'd have to loosen it now to pull it down. That's pretty much in there. These wires here, I'm going to go ahead and just twist them up a little bit more, and then I'm just going to Z-fold them. So we're just going to fold them up like that. And then I want to put that connector facing up. So I'm going to kind of push the wires up against the casing, and I want that pointing up. So I can grab him with the tweezers and attach my board here. That control board, you can go in and change all the settings in the camera. So your contrast, your sharpness, all that stuff. This connector, we want to go to our flight controller. The other thing we can do is get that just bundled up the way we want it, and we can zip tie it so it doesn't come out of there. So let's grab our quadcopter here, and we're just going to make our connection between our camera and our flight controller. Okay. Alright, is that better? You can see now that standoff needs to go down inside here. Okay. So we're going to get him started. And now we just want to make sure when we're pushing our standoffs in, we don't want to pinch our motor wires. So just come in here and cleanly move your motor wires out of the way a little bit, so you're not smushing them. Like right here, I'm kind of pinching that motor wire. I want to just pull him out of the way a little bit. I like to use a chopstick with a blunt end because you don't have to worry about the sharpness of it, you know. And then back here, I was pinching on him a little bit, so we'll pull them motor wires out of the way. So now I can feel that I'm on carbon only. I'm not on my motor wires. So we're going to turn that over, and we'll go ahead and put our body screws in. Alright, so we have all 4 of our standoff screws in underneath here. We have our battery pad and our standoff secured on this side, and we have our everything underneath. Let me zoom out for you. Alright, so we have everything kind of put together now. We're looking better. We look like a real quadcopter now. So we got plenty of space, plenty of air space, plenty of plenty of slack in our wiring. So everything's buttoned down nice and tight. Our motor screws are only hand tight, or they're just kind of little, finger tight. We didn't put them all the way on. They're good enough to where they're not going to vibrate. So now it's time to, we'll just kind of bend our antenna up into place here. Go ahead and get the large zip tie put on here. And then basically I'm just going to put him right on the top here. Let me see here. I want that to come out right there, so I need to put him like this. I like using wire ties and heat shrink. It's super light. They're extremely durable. I mean, you can really beat on them, and they don't break off real easy. TPU mounts would be kind of neat. I guess, in the future, could always make like a shark fin or something, but, something like that works for me. Now I want to grab some of my shrink tubing. Want to just pull it where it needs to be so it'll stay out of the props. That's the whole point of this. We'll just heat that up. So now that gives us a nice amount of range because it's up out of everything. It's up out of the way. The other thing is it can act like a turtle stick. So if it's upside down, right now it's hot. I don't want to deform it. but you can get the idea. That baby ripping through the tree line or something, it still can fold down and bend a little bit without breaking off. And then because the wire tie is 5 millimeters wide, it doesn't bend this way or this way very easy, so it stays out of our props. I'm gonna go ahead and grab a 4-inch wire tie and get him tied up, and then this build will be pretty much done. Let me go ahead and do that real quick. Cut right in front of it. Alright, so that's it. All the pieces and parts are now wired together. Many days of filming. I can't even stress to you how much I am looking forward to all the hours of editing. The one thing we need to do for sure before we do anything else is to get a continuity check. I usually like to do that in between each step, but continuity set up here, so we're ready to go. So you can see 0, 0, 0. That's a direct short. There's nothing in between. We'll get our pigtail out here. Now, when we first plug this in, we're going to get a little bit of a beep because the capacitors that are in line on the VTX and on the whip right here are in a short. So once they charge up, then it shouldn't beep anymore. Okay, so that's pretty good. All right, so looking good there. No, if that was happening, that means you've soldered something together, and that's not going to work out too well for you. So we're good to go. We can plug a Lipo into this without worry. We got a 4S Lipo. Make sure our barrels line up, ground to ground. All right. That beep tells us that we don't have an RX hooked up to it. So our transmitter's not hooked up to it. But everything chimed up. All the LEDs come on. We're going to do it again. Just because. Yep, everything looks good. It's fun to... It's really fun to power it up and to have it come to life in a way. You know, just the sounds and the beeps and everything that really kind of gets you excited, you know. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a monitor real quick and we're just going to plug it in again and we're going to make sure we have video. All right, so we have our screen here. And just put that off to the side, plug it in. All right, so here we go. We got video, so that's good. All right, so the next step is to go ahead and get our USB port and plug in to our computer and connect into Betaflight. So we should go through some of the settings and things in here. So we'll do some dump file information as well. So stay tuned for part 2, and this should wrap up part 1. You know, I hope that this build video is helping you out, and you know, if it is, give me a thumbs up and subscribe. And if you hated it, man, you give me a thumbs down. It all works. Enjoy the breeze.